Good morning, everyone. I can't believe how many people actually made out of bed by 10 a.m. at Black Hat to watch us open a door. You could do that yourselves. Thanks for coming today. And our talk is called Perimeter Breached Hacking an Access Control System. It represents a lot more months than we'd like to admit of research on this target. And we're happy to be able to share it with you today. Before we get started, quick who am I? My name is Steve Povolny. I'm head of advanced threat research and principal engineer at Trellix. And my Twitter handle is there if you want to connect afterwards or have questions. Now, as a manager on the team, everybody thinks all I do is Excel spreadsheets, which is generally true, but I do have some core technical interests as well. And some of those are vulnerability root cause analysis, reversing, exploitation, and with Sam, this is my first chance to do some hardware hacking, so fun chance to learn.
Yeah, and my name is Sam Quinn. I'm a senior security researcher at Trellix. And I could have summed up all of my interests in just hacking in general, but I really do like exploitation, hardware hacking, embedded systems like IoT devices, and of course, OS fundamentals.
And Sam and I have interests outside of the lab, so when we're not finding crashes in the lab, we're out mountain biking and crashes are finding us. So that's legitimate photos that are GIFs of both of us. Yeah, we're obviously experts at that as well. All right, all levity aside, let's get right into the target here. And we're talking today about the HID Mercury Access Control Panel. Specifically, this is the Linnell 4420, which is an OEM vendor of the HID Mercury Access Controller. I'm going to talk a little bit about the who, the what, the why, the how of this project. And before I do that, I want to set the stage a little bit for how this device is typically used. So this red panel or controller is actually what you see on the door, behind the door in the typical setup. That's going to usually be in a server closet. In this case, though, it's often deployed on a local network. Very rarely would we see this at the perimeter, not behind a firewall or internet exposed. Certainly possible, but much more likely on a local network here. And this controller is used to manage up to 64 doors or badges. They can be daisy-chained as well to support essentially an infinite number. Now, for Linnell, there's a management server or local server called the OnGuard, which is responsible for doing all of the badge provisioning, access control, all of the door-related functions. And the controller itself is kind of just a dumb device that processes those commands and opens and closes relays. Now, why are we looking at access control? Well, we got interested in this, of course, because critical infrastructure and industrial control systems have been widely targeted, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, increasingly so. More so, I would say the access control area is one of those that's been heavily under-audited by the research community, and so it really caught our attention. One of the other things that really caught our attention when we first started looking at this device was some marketing by Linnell that said that this was certified for use in government facilities. Now, we found out throughout the process of talking with Carrier and Linnell that this is actually intended to be a physical security certification, but regardless, it inspired us to do the research because it says it was approved following rigorous security, vulnerability, and interoperability testing. Okay, so we had a little finger-licking moment there, and that's what inspired all of this. So that's kind of the why. The what, and this is the spoiler alert, we've already disclosed these, and these are all fully patched, so comfortable to share these. We have 8 vulnerabilities that we submitted for disclosure, 4 of which are true zero-day vulnerabilities and unauthenticated remote code execution. We're going to focus on just 3 of them today, given the time constraints we have at Black Hat, and we'll have a little bit more detail in our DEF CON talk as well if you want to join us. All right, so that brings us to the who. Who's affected by these? Well, when we did this project originally on the Linnell 4420 board, we kind of had thought that that was the extent of impacted panels. What we found out later through talking to Carrier, Linnell, and Mercury was that there was 8 additional panels that were also vulnerable to these same issues, bringing us to a total of 9 affected panels. And more so, over 20 OEM vendors, which put a sticker on the HID Mercury boards, were affected by all vulnerabilities. So this represents millions of controllers at tens of thousands of sites worldwide, and really the vast majority of Fortune 100 companies. So the install base is pretty significant here. And finally, these are now added to the 4420 was added to the government's APL, or approved product list, meaning there's no additional security certifications that they need to put these in a sensitive or protected facility. The way that we approached this project is we didn't want to just get up here and dump CVs on you guys. That's kind of an old story. We're going to do that, but not just that. We're also going to talk about the kind of a choose your own adventure style, where we say, at various decision points in this process, what did we decide to do, and what was the logic or rationale behind it? Now, we actually presented part of this research at Hardware I/O a couple months ago, but we spent a lot more of our focus there talking on the hardware analysis, hardware hacking, to get us to the point where we had a root shell on the device. So for today's purposes, both Black Hat and DEF CON, we'll be starting with a root shell. And there's no vulnerabilities to get to this point. There was a lot of work and hardware analysis to get a root shell, but the vulnerabilities really were only possible to find from this point of analysis on. Let's start by looking at some of the standard operations on this control panel. As you might imagine, one of the first things we do is scan the open network ports. And we found just 3 open ports here. The web server, which runs 80 and SSL 443, and also port 3001, which is used as the on-guard management port. So that's that LSM, the local security manager, that manages the device. Now, we didn't have that set up at the time because we bought our first board off of eBay. And so we really didn't have anything to do with that port at the time. When the web server spins up, you're greeted with a typical admin, password login. This is where typical session management is done, and done properly in many places. Hint, hint. But this is where we track session cookies, and we are able to authenticate to the device. When you log in, you're greeted with some of these diagnostics and configuration tabs. What you might notice from the web server is very little to none of this has anything to do with access control or doors or badges. This is all device configuration contents. Nonetheless, it became one of the most interesting places for us to look, especially at the network setting tabs. And we'll go into a lot more detail on why we chose that in just a moment here. So that brings us to our first choose your own adventure, which was our objective at this point was pretty clear cut. We wanted to find a 0-day RCE vulnerability and ideally have it be unauthenticated so that we could do network-based attacks without having to log in. 3 different areas we could have investigated. An OS vulnerability, where we're looking for proprietary code or applications, libraries and files from the vendors, keys, credentials, crypto, all that kind of stuff. We kind of opted to go for more of a web-based and network-based approach where we're looking for things like a command injection, because we have access to the web server, of course, and that can be a really great place to start analysis. On the network vuln side, we'd be typically looking at the network stack itself, probably for an end day in some of the third-party libraries or the stack, but we ended up going with the web-based vulnerability. One of the key areas for web-based attacks includes command injections. And this was our ideal candidate because if you look at one of the startup processes on the controller itself, there's a DHCP scriptlet that's run as root here, which processes the host name with a -h switch for the controller itself. In this case, it's called controller 1. And we can see that that controller is actually taken from the host name file on the device. So if we can command inject into the host name, which of course we're going to show you the ability to do, we might be able to actually execute code here. So let's talk about some of the character restrictions on the network page, and that's what we're on, the network settings page. If you look at where the controller is, the host name is set, which in this case is called controller 1, we have some character restrictions on the client side, which are alphanumeric characters and period and hyphen. When we look at the actual JavaScript that's responsible for processing that, the string match does absolutely match up to that. We see alphanumeric and dash and dot characters as being the only ones allowed. Well, as we all know, client-side is not typically the only thing that's being checked. There's also server-side checks here. And we see this function called XSS string test, or the cross-site scripting string test. Now, they do look for a number of cross-site scripting characters in here, and this is an additional character filter list. But not just for XSS. There's also some interesting command injection restrictions here. We'd like to be able to use the / character for paths. We'd like to be able to use the semicolon for command injection. But what you might notice in here is that they aren't checking for things like the sigil, the $, or parentheses. And I'll come back to that in just a moment here. The final thing that is being parsed here is a function called parseFormsData, where there's a string tokenizer function that's actually splitting the hostname string anytime it sees an equals or white space, single white space character. Now, white space characters are super useful when you're using command injection. So to get around that, we use that $ and parentheses to do command injection instead of a semicolon. And we replace the single white spaces with tab characters or \t here. And that worked perfectly well because Linux will interpret any white space characters as well as the others. Before we go into the command injection and kind of show you that part of it live, and we're going to break up the attack into kind of live sections on stage here, because that makes it easier to get massive epic failures. Let's talk about the way that authentication is handled for gets and posts to the web server. Get requests are handled pretty typically here. You get a session ID by calling get session ID function, and then you compare that session ID to the session ID that's taken from the cookie value. That all makes sense, and if that check validates, you're good to go. Now, what's a little bit strange is the way that post requests are being handled. And the way that posts are done starts out the same way. Get session ID from a cookie, but as you might see, that's never compared to anything. So it's just checking that any session ID exists. And you'll see in our command injection, we use 1337 as our session ID. You can use anything you want here, and any post request data will succeed unauthenticated. All right, so Sam's going to start us off by loading up a live demo here where we show you a little bit more of the command injection, how that works, the auth bypass, and we're going to hack this incrementally as we show you here.
That's way too small. Oh, there we go. So I'll first of all start off with our command and control server. This is to bypass not having to type every script that we want to run into that hostname. So this will eventually give out some more commands for us to run. We'll come back to this in just a little bit, though. So then next, we'll start off by actually doing the command injection. So I will first go ahead and cat that out for you. It's a simple bash script, and since we're using curl, we're not using any of the JavaScript that Steve showed to do any of the character restrictions. And it looks kind of confusing. We'll dive into it a little bit more in a bit. But the most important thing that I want to point out here is that the session ID is a bogus session ID. So this is unauthenticated here. And we'll go ahead and run that. All right. And so that has ran. So now if we go ahead and pull up the web server and log in, use the password manager at Black Hat. Here we go. Log in and go to that network page where the host name is shown. It did indeed get all of those restricted characters applied, and our host name is now a valid command injection. However, as Steve mentioned, it does only run at boot, so we'll kind of go back into our slides here and kind of cover how we kind of used this still to exploit the system. So the first thing, as Steve mentioned, that what's highlighted in red here is not a space. It's indeed a tab, which works perfectly fine for the Linux interpreter. And as he also mentioned, we are running this at boot up through the DHCP call. This is how the Linux controller of the device gets an IP address for the first time. And most importantly, we want it's happening through the host name, as he mentioned. But this is the command we actually want to run. This reaches out to that Python listener that we set up, our C2 server, where we can run arbitrary commands through that and not have to worry about the restricted characters. However, this command injection is a blocking call. So, of course, we don't have an IP address at this point to actually call this. So we actually nest another DHCP call inside of the original where we're actually injecting into. So this way, we actually have networking set up, and that wget can actually take place. And this was our first CVE that we filed. It is an unauthenticated command injection. The only thing dropping it from a 10.0 CVSS is that it needs to actually have that reboot to actually trigger. So it doesn't trigger on command like we would hoped. But that is still a great CVE, and we continued our research, where we now wanted to we really wanted to find a reboot primitive to actually have that command injection take place. So the first thing we looked at was trying to find an unauthenticated reboot through the web server. However, there was a reboot, like when you click apply settings, it did indeed reboot the device. However, that was checking the cookies correctly, so that wasn't a valid way to reboot the device. We did kind of look into DOSing the system. There is a watchdog timer that if any process hangs for too long, it will reboot the device. This did work about after an hour of sending thousands and thousands of GET requests to the device. However, it's pretty noisy and slow and kind of not as cool as we hoped. So we continued to look for a way to actually crash the device. And if we can cause a segmentation fault on the controller, it would actually reboot the device itself. So our next goal was to actually try to find memory corruption vulnerabilities. And to do that, we wanted to actually identify, if it does segfault, to make sure that it does reboot. And the controller itself has a custom core dump handler. Every time any application that dumps its core will run this script. And it looks pretty standard from this view. But if we actually look into that script, it does a bunch of stuff for debugging. But the last line of it, I don't know if you can see it, it says reboot. So this is exactly what we're looking for. And all of the web pages are CGI bin files, which are compiled. And if you can cause any of those to crash, we do indeed dump core, run this script, and get that reboot that we're looking for. So to improve our odds of trying to find memory corruption vulnerabilities, and because all of the web servers or websites are running CGI bin files, we started to actually create little automation scripts to actually improve our odds of finding these kind of dangerous functions that are typical for memory corruption vulnerabilities. We wrote an IDA Python script to search for these, but most importantly, before any cookie check took place, this way that we could improve our odds of actually hitting one of these dangerous functions before any cookie check took place, and it would be unauthenticated. So you can see that a few of these did indeed have some of these dangerous functions, but looking at them statically, all of them did have static size fields, were programmed correctly. Nothing we could do really there, except for on the next page here, we actually did find one in the advanced network CGI bin file where there were a couple calls to stir copy where we controlled both inputs and outputs, and that's always a good sign for memory corruption. So we did look at that statically and kind of identified that from this script here, but we wanted to test it out. And it's never good to use your only board that you have and try things live, because you could corrupt the machine. And so we actually set up a ARM QEMU VM, a full system VM, and took the actual flash images of the device and ch-rooted into them, and kind of created a poor man's emulator, and then eventually we used it for fuzzing. But before we dive into that, now that the system has that ch-root environment and all of the library files and whatnot are in the right place, we can actually just run these CGI bin files as normal. And you can see here highlighted, this is a joke, we're sending the post data of hack yourself into this advanced network CGI bin file. And of course, it actually does respond with valid HTML, and this is how these CGI bin files take post parameters. But to actually fuzz it and try to figure out a way to see if we missed anything through our Python automation, we wanted to actually use a mutator. And to do this, we used the simplest mutator I know of. It's Redamza. It's pretty great. You send in data into the Redamza through standard in, and it mutates the data and comes out differently. And that's great for trying to fuzz this exact target. What we did is we took the valid post parameters for advanced network CGI, passed it into Redamza, and as you can see, all it did is change the last octet of a DNS server to -1. So it does different things every single time, and this one was a pretty good test in my opinion. But running this manually, that's not it wouldn't be very efficient, that's for sure. So this is the coolest fuzzer that I've written so far. It's like 15 lines of code, and it's just a bash script where it takes that post parameters, passes it into Redamza to be mutated, and then just sends the mutated data directly into the CGI bin files that we're trying to look at. And the CGI bin files always return a 0 if it ran successfully. So if anything isn't successful return value, we actually spin it up in GDB and then run a backtrace on it with the same test case. So as you can see in this example here, this was indeed a crash. In a count stir, Redamza decided to make it much longer and added a bunch of random characters. And you can see in the bottom, since we rerun it in GDB, you can see that it crashed in stir copy, and it gave you a full backtrace of the system. So pretty simple to set up, and honestly a pretty fun fuzzer. And however, all of that automation work didn't find any more vulnerabilities than we found statically, but it was still a good sidebar. This was a second CVE that we filed for this talk, and it was an unauthenticated denial of service. Because it was only an out-of-bounds read for that segmentation fault, we couldn't use it to exploit the device. However, we were able to use this to cause the segmentation fault to reboot it, so a denial of service there. And then now that we have kind of the chain of these two vulnerabilities together, we can indeed actually kind of exploit the device. And I'll have Steve kind of walk us through the next steps.
Yeah, so now we're at a point where we have a fully working exploit chain. We have a command injection that runs at reboot, and we have a way to force reboot through that segmentation fault core dump handler. So this was a great point for us to actually update to the latest firmware. Because we bought our first device off of eBay, we didn't really have the ability to do this. So we put heavy quotes around social engineering here. Really what we did is we called up a third-party installer in our Portland area called Convergent, and they do a lot of installs for Linnell. And we may have done a little cloak and dagger in terms of what our intentions were at this point, but they came out and built us a couple iterations of this behemoth you see on stage here. So that gave us the ability to integrate the OnGuard management server for the first time. We built out a fully functional demo unit with the controller and card reader. This is wired exactly as it would be in any facility, with the exception that typically the controller is going to be in a supply closet or a server closet. More importantly, they gave us some advanced training on the normal operations of this device and how to use the management server, provision badges, and access control. And the most important thing is we finally had the ability to update to the latest version of firmware. Not only that, but because we had a separate standalone server for OnGuard, we had a copy of the firmware on the local file system, the legitimate firmware that we could use to play with. All right, so this brought us to a success and failure road here. On the one hand, we'll start with our failure. We had our seg fault handling that rebooted on any system binary before that gave us our stir copy forced reboot. Well, after this update, seg fault only caused a reboot of the device with the two main system binaries. And so we lost that unauthenticated DOS on the latest version of firmware at the time. And these are the two system binaries that actually do still reboot. However, the more important thing is that our command injection vulnerability survived this update. It was not patched out or discovered, and we knew that we for sure could find a way to cause this device to reboot. That brought us to choose your own adventure number 3, where now that our DOS was dead, we had to find a new method of achieving that unauthenticated RCE. There's a few different options here. One would be to find a new standalone vulnerability, kind of a 0 or 1 click, to rule them all. We could find a reboot primitive or a new reboot primitive or crash that we could actually chain to replace our broken chain here. Or we could have moved forward and prepared our quote-unquote malware or door exploit, because we know at some point the door is going to go down or be rebooted and our command injection will get triggered. Obviously, we're way too lazy for that. We're not going to wait for it to reboot by itself. We had some new toys to play with this firmware update. And one of the things that was added in the update was this diagnostics menu in the web server, which had a firmware upload option. That firmware upload option clearly states that it will reboot the board if you upload the firmware. So now we at least have an authenticated way to reboot the device, but that's not good enough. All right, so I'm going to give another little live demo here, and we're going to show you guys how we actually get around this.
It's already up down there.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're back to the panel here, and what I'm going to do is, you can see the developer settings on the right side, and I'm going to actually log out real quickly. I'm going to log back in to show you how the session cookies are handled here. All right, so if you look on the right, you'll see the network requests going through. And we'll see the session ID is appended onto the end of the banner and menu and welcome page. The new page that was added was this diagnostics menu. And when I clicked on that, what you'll see is the diagnostics CGI with the session ID is added to it. And that is done appropriately. And we're going to right-click on this, and we're going to copy it and just make sure that that is working as intended from logged out. But before we do that, I want to just show one thing. As I clicked on that diagnostics menu, there was another CGI file loaded, view firmware update.cgi. And if you have sharp eyes, you probably realize that there's no session ID on that. OK, so let's go ahead and log out. And we'll go ahead and paste into here the full request that we had for the diagnostics menu. And obviously, the session cookie is invalid, so it gives us this timeout, and it no longer works. However, if we remember that CGI page that we had just gone to, and we go to it directly from a logged out session, because there's no session ID checking whatsoever, we can go to this page completely unauthenticated, bypassing all logins, no session cookie whatsoever, and now we can upload files directly. So this is obviously a major flaw, and it is part of the vulnerability reported here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually choose a file here, and I'm going to start it uploading. And what you're going to hear is this is going to cause a crash. I'm going to explain to you as it loads here what's happening. If you have sharp ears, you'll probably hear the device, the door beep and reboot, because that's what we're trying to get it to do. So I'll go ahead and load the file, and then we'll go back to slides and resume talking about what we just did. OK. All right, so we now have the ability to control file input unauthenticated. And some of the areas that we might be interested in looking at, there, the door just rebooted, you probably heard it up front. Some of the areas that we're looking at are user-controlled input here. We could look at the file contents itself. We could look at things like the parsing of the file name, or even some of the sizes. These are typical user-controlled input fields. Now, when we look back at that diagnostics or firmware update page, one of the first things that Sam and I tried was just creating an empty file. In this case, we call it foobar.txt. It has nothing in it. We go ahead and try to install it. And sure enough, it takes it, tries to install it, and it ends up erroring out. One of the things that it says in the error message is this invalid signature size. Now, that clued us into that there was probably some signature being checked for the file. And we decided to look at the legitimate firmware file to see what was happening. Now, it's an encrypted file. We pulled it directly off that OnGuard server. And so for the most part, it's pretty uninteresting until you get to the last hex 158 bytes, which probably looks familiar to many of you. This is a base64 encoded blob that represents the file signature. But more importantly, the last 3 bytes are an ASCII representation of that signature size, 158. So we knew that it was parsing this not dynamically byte by byte, but taking a user-controlled value. That's a great place to look further at the code and see if it's being handled correctly. First thing I'll draw your attention to in that firmware size check here is a malloc of a hex 190 bytes, so a static sized malloc here. And of course, then the file is open for reading, the firmware file. So far, so good. The next thing that happens is a file seek or an fseek, where it'll go to the end of the file minus 3 bytes. And as you would imagine, it's taking those 3 bytes as the ASCII size value of the signature size. And it'll read those 3 bytes in using the fread function. Then it does a stir to L or string to long conversion to take that 158 or whatever is specified and convert it to a long. And as you guessed it, that's used as one of the arguments to the fread function here. So this is where the actual heap overflow will happen. This is where we can overflow that static sized malloc buffer. And just a few instructions later in the file close function is where we'll actually see the crash happen. So we spent a lot of time doing like ROP gadgets in the emulator. We got a full single ROP gadget working to be able to get full code execution in our emulator. But when we transferred it back to hardware, we just ran out of time to get it working. We had process threading issues. We had heap manipulation problems. So we got this working in the emulator. We never ended up getting it working on the device hardware. But we're hackers. We're lazy. We just used it for the segfault reboot and chained it with the command injection either way. We are going to talk about that ROP stuff at DEF CON. If you want to come, that'll be really the only thing that's different for that talk. But we're going to explore that in the extra 5 minutes we have. So to understand this heap overflow, essentially we made a fake copy of the firmware, just a random empty file. And we filled it with a unique and predictable pattern. If you think of your Metasploit pattern create or pattern generate, that's what we're doing here to find the different offsets that we can control. Now, this is an encrypted file, so it does require the salted __ encryption header. It does check that. And of course, we changed the file signature size from 158 to anything over 190. We chose 999 here as an arbitrarily large value. Then we set a breakpoint before what we perceived would be the controlled execution in that fclose function. And what I want to draw your attention to is this branch instruction. So BLX is an unconditional branch in ARM, which will branch to the R3 register. Why is that important? Well, as you can see from the registers printed out here, we control with our pattern data registers R0, R1, R3, and R6. And R4, we control the pointer to our pattern data. And that'll be really important when we talk about ROP later. Again, we're not going to waste the time on that right now, but just a little bit of understanding. We ended up using this just for the segmentation fault and the forced reboot. And that's what you heard when the door rebooted. This ultimately was filed as our highest CVSS score of a 10.0. It is an unauthenticated full remote code execution on the device. All right, so Sam's going to take us home just by talking about the exploitation of this device, how we turn these 3 vulnerabilities into something that actually impacts the physical hardware. And again, air quotes on malware, right? We don't write and release malware. This is a proof of concept. Malware is a kind of an aggressive term there, but this is just to demonstrate that we can actually control the door's functions.
And yeah, and this was our last, choose your opponent venture, where we could have gone around about this malware in 2 different ways. Probably most people that were actually trying to extract money would go the ransomware way, demand money or Bitcoin to have access to your doors again. It's pretty lame. We ended up going with the Ghost in the Shell, James Bond approach to gain secret hidden access to a facility, and that's ended up what we did on this device. But to do that, we still had to actually control the physical locks. And we'll have to dive into how the locks on these doors are actually handled, and they're through the use of relays. As you see here highlighted in red, these are actually the relays, which are just electrical switches. When voltage is applied, it either unlocks the switch or locks it, and those are directly connected to the locks themselves through these output pins. And to actually find how the software controls these relays, it was as simple as actually searching through the main system binary for relay, and you can see that there is a individual function for on and off for each of these relays. So to look at how they actually handle the unlocking of those relays, you can look into them, and it's even more simple, where it's actually just an ioctl call with a file descriptor to the GPIO pins that handle these relays, parameter to either unlock or close, and a 0 indexed array of which relay to actually control. So to create our malware, we just took that exact code, that pseudocode, added it to a C file, and then cross-compiled it for ARM, and we ran it on the device. However, you can see that there's a while loop here. This is our brute force hacking method to actually keep the door unlocked. When we first tried this ioctl call, it would just instantly relock, and that was probably because there's some monitoring going on the system where it wants to keep the door locked, and we want to keep it open. So calling it every millisecond actually seemed to work pretty good to take precedence over any other monitoring processes. So to kind of summarize what we've been doing up here on stage, live, hacking this device, and then kind of show you a sneak preview of what we're going to do, we first started off by having that command injection in the host name. However, if you remember, it only triggers on reboot, so we had to upload that fake firmware update file to cause a segmentation fault and cause a reboot. Then the command injection does indeed run on startup, and will connect to our C2 server, which is our laptop for this case. It could have been any machine, and download more scripts that we'll use for further exploitation. Then it does indeed open a listener on the device, which now will connect to the reverse shell, and then of course open the the door. And this is what we hope to look like after,
Before you do it, real quick. Before you do it.
Yeah.
So before we tempt the demo gods with our final demo, we are going to put up a QR code at the end here for Q&A. We have a quick filming we have to do afterwards. So if you have questions, we won't be doing them live, but you can come find us after, or you can scan the QR code here if you want to ask any questions directly. Go ahead and take your chance now to do that. While you're doing that, I want to give a quick thanks before we show our final demo here to Carrier, to John and Josh. Carrier did an awesome job facilitating the disclosure with us to Mercury and making sure that these were all patched timely. So thank you guys. Really appreciate the hard work there and the vendor responsibility. All right, so let's go ahead and see if we can epically fail on stage, Sam.
All right. Okay. QR code's gone. Here we go. So we'll first of all go ahead and connect to that reverse shell on the device. We're using SoCat here because it's a little nicer than Netcat. And as you can see, we do actually now have a root shell. And if I type who am I, you can see we do have a root access to the device. And obviously, Steve can't get in. So we'll run our super elite open door hack. And as you can hear, the relay is triggered, and we can now successfully walk through the door.
like I said, 40 minutes to watch us open a door. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Please connect with us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter afterwards. If you have questions, stick around. We'll be around out in the hallway because there's another session coming up. And thank you, everyone, so much for your time.
Thank you.